you know who Daumier is, I imagine, because he's one of the world's greatest caricaturists. And at first thought, you wouldn't think of him and Millet as having very much in common at all. But in fact, they do. And that's what's very interesting about pairing the two of them. So this is Honoré Daumier, who, well, you can see, look at the mischievous look in his eye.
It's a great picture.
It's a great picture, isn't it? And you can see the guy's taken everything in, and that there's a, he's also got a kind of, there's a satiric wit there in the back. He's a very, very kind person, actually, and very empathetic, but not someone you wanted to mess with. He comes actually as a number of figures in this period. He comes from Marseille. Cézanne came from near Marseille, Zola. And the Marseille, of course, the people from Marseille were the ones who marched on Paris and saved the revolution. They're a spunky bunch in a very old culture, one of the oldest cities in France, as old as Naples, which goes back to Greek times. His father was a glazier, but he had pretensions to be a poet, and he brought the whole family to Paris. And he had 2 weeks of fame and popularity in the court of Louis XVIII. And then he was dropped and forgotten. And when Daumier was 13, his father went mad and was committed to an asylum. At which point, Daumier had to make a living. So he was, first of all, a messenger for a bailiff. So he got to see the interior of the courts and the way the legal system worked. Then later he worked as a bookseller in a bookstore on a very busy avenue where he got to see the whole, every level, every class of Paris would go by the window every day. So these were very formative experiences. He always drew. He had, there were artists in his family. And when he's, let's see, he was in his mid-20s. He got a job working for a, actually earlier, no, he was younger than that, I'm sorry. He's in his mid-20s. He gets a job working for a satirical magazine. And this is his caricature of Louis Philippe. One of, this was a time when France went back and forth between the Bonaparte family, the older royal family, and the people. And it was a topsy-turvy period for 100 years in France, with constant rebellions, constant street fighting, and in between these absurd regimes. So what's going on in this? The poor are being forced to give their money, which is being carried up by these people and fed directly into the mouth of the king, who is, he's always caricatured by Daumier as having a pear-shaped face. Pear is a rude word, has a rude connotation in French too. Mm. But the king was so upset by this particular published caricature that he had Daumier thrown in jail. He spent 2 months in jail and 4 months in an asylum the king insisted on the asylum because he wanted to make it clear to everyone that someone who would do an image like this of him had to be crazy. But it didn't do it. If anything, it just made Daumier we sharpened his wit. That experience. And this is not a caricature, but it's a very important image and very famous. It's called the Massacre on Rue Tresnonian. It was done in 1834. There'd been laborers were protesting work conditions, and I think it began in Lyon, but it spread to Paris. There were street demonstrations. They started battling the authorities, and on this particular street, snipers in the top of one of the houses fired on the troops. So the response of the troops was to force entry into the apartment building, which was several stories high, and slaughter everyone in the building, men, women, and children. And you can see his outrage in this, which was an extremely, when it was published, it became notorious, this print. You can also see what an incredibly good draftsman Daumier was. But you can see there's a man who's been shot, there's a baby lying dead under him, an old man here, a woman here. But the government was furious, and they seized as many of the prints as they could, and they broke up the stone that this was printed on. This is a lithograph. Almost all of his work is lithography. He was one of the masters, early masters of lithography. But at this point, he was famous and notorious in Paris, and there was no doubt as to where he stood. He stood for the Republic, always. And he also had a very low opinion of the law and did a whole series. This is just one of many, many images caricaturing lawyers and judges and the entire legal profession, which he despised. It's a wonderful drawing. And also the social mores, he was forever caricaturing, you know, he was forever making fun of the French middle class and their pretensions and habits.
Actually, did.
Yeah. Always youth.
Huh.
Well, in 1848, there was another one of the many uprisings, but this was a major one. The Parisians finally got rid of the monarchy and got a republic, and things opened up, not just for Daumier, but for any number of artists in Paris. The requirements at the academy and in the salon changed. A lot of artists who'd been kept out were now able to get in. In the case of Daumier, he painted on the side. He was famous for his prints. That's what he's historically known for. But he did wonderful paintings on the side, which he didn't show. They were shown en masse a year before he died, and he received an immense amount of praise for these paintings, which are very simple, but very powerful. He always simplifies things to go for the main effect, which is always an emotional effect. And you can see that he's on the side of the people, the common people, which is something that links him with Millet. He and Millet met in actually 1840, and Daumier would have a profound effect on Millet, especially on the way Millet drew. And you'll see that later. And you'll see, if you look at these closely and then you look at Millet, you can see really strong similarities between their treatment of the figure And also, even though Daumier is totally a city slicker who's, very aware of all the currents in the city and treating them in his work, whereas Millet was a peasant who became a painter, and his whole thing is rural life and the peasant world. But their sympathy for the common man is the same. But Millet could do things like this. He was quite capable of doing almost Baroque work if he felt like it. And of course, another lawyer. This is interesting. Millet wasn't on the surface a religious man. Daumier wasn't on the surface a religious man. Millet was. But Daumier, like a lot of populist radicals, empathized with the Christ who sided with the people and who was, tried and finally killed because of his support for the people. It's a very interesting painting, I think. Daumier was married. He had a wife who he apparently was really devoted to. He called her Didine. Her name was actually Leopoldine, and she was a seamstress, I believe, a dressmaker. But he once said, "The burdens of a woman are more than the average man could ever endure." And he did sculpture. Often he did sculpture as a preliminary to doing a painting. He never showed them, and many of them were lost. It was only later that some of them were actually made into bronze after his death. But this one, which has survived, is called Heavy Burden. And he's trying to express just the hard work. This woman with her huge basket of laundry and also her child that she has to care for, struggling apparently against the wind. And he did many variations on this particular theme. His work, once people became aware of it, had a big influence actually on the modernists. Picasso was, when he first came to Paris, did a lot of paintings that you can see are influenced by Millet. I'm sorry, I keep saying Millet, I mean Daumier. Well, being a printmaker and having worked in a bookstore, he also did a series like this of people in bookstores and people in shops examining prints, purchasing prints. And he also did a number treating the art world in general. This is kind of funny. It's the unhappy countenance of a sculpture placed in the middle of a bunch of paintings. The sculpture's rebelling against this situation. And it's interesting, it's the most animated thing in the room. All the people who've come to see the artwork look like they're about to fall asleep. This is a self-portrait. You see, he doesn't spare himself. He's got a wonderful sense of humor. And Baudelaire, late in life, Baudelaire became very interested in him. And he commented that Daumier was unconcerned with his works. He was always out drinking with barge captains, which is it reminds me of Turner, you know? He was comfortable with ordinary people, and he didn't like the upper levels of society. He didn't ever try to push himself on them or be successful in those realms. And he didn't have to, because he made a decent living with his prints. This is a funny one. It's the connoisseur. contemplating his own collection, in particular the Venus de Milo, which at this point was all the rage in Paris. And but it's funny because the Venus de Milo is contemplating him. Again, a woman with a child and a pile of laundry laboring up the steps at evening. One of his more powerful works, I think, and it's interesting how much he communicates in such a simplified form, you know. Wonderful use of negative and positive space in this. This is known as the third-class carriage. Trains had 3 classes. And of course, he empathized most with the people in the third-class carriage. And he focuses again on women, an old, probably a grandmother, 2 children, the mother breastfeeding the child. But the other thing that becomes clear here, and it's true of much of his paintings, he's really working in a variation on chiaroscuro. Very loose, very bold, but the strongest colors are in the light, the purest colors. He did this series actually on the different classes in the train for an American. The Americans were beginning to descend on Paris, and Daumier and Millet were artists that they were very interested in. Yeah. What happened in the galleries and the literary scene in those days was incredibly passionate, and he's making fun of it here. It's a literary discussion at a gallery, but really, with the rising middle class, the big entertainment, one of the primary forms of entertainment was to go to the galleries and argue about everything, and even assault each other. Well, he eventually, as he gets older, he actually begins to lose his sight. This is shortly before that happened. And in his last years, when he can no longer produce art because he's gone blind, Corot, the painter Corot of the Barbizon school, gives him a cottage in Barbizon to live out his last days. There was a real closeness. There was a fraternité between all these artists, which had to do with their class position. It also had to do with their sympathies and the fact that they were Republicans, they were socialists. They believed in working together and helping each other out. But I love this depiction, which has come down as one of the most memorable depictions of Don Quixote, with obviously Sancho Panza in the distance, though there's just a smudge, but you can sort of see him there. And this unfinished one, which is very, very powerful, even in its unfinished state. There's somewhere, and I don't remember it because I read Don Quixote so long ago, where they come upon a dead donkey. And this is the moment. I don't know if anyone remembers that.
I don't remember that, but didn't Picasso do a very similar painting?
Yes.
It's like very similar.
Picasso, one of the things about Picasso is he stole from everyone. And certain artists, he went, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, really. Certain artists just really absorbed his, you know, held his interest, and Daumier was one of them. To some extent, Millet, actually, though the artist who went crazy over Millet, as Julie knows, was Van Gogh. Van Gogh did something like 37 variations on Millet's work. but that we'll come to that in a minute, because this is the end of Daumier. And Millet, who was about 8 years younger than just a second, just looking for my notes here. 8 years younger than Daumier, comes from a very different background. He actually does come from a peasant background. You can see, very serious man here. He came from a farming family, peasant farming family in Normandy. And until 19, he did just back-breaking work on the farm from dawn till dusk. His grandmother engaged 2 priests to teach him Latin and literature. And his father, who had an appreciation for art and music to some degree, sent him to study at age 19, sent him away from the farm to study portraiture. I guess they both figured that that was one area in which he could make money. He went on to Paris, studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, but he didn't like the elite art scene in Paris at all. He had a work rejected from the Salon in 1839. He goes back and forth for a while between Paris and the farm. He gets disenchanted, goes back to the farm. After his father dies, he goes back to the farm to take over the farm, and his grandmother tells him to go back to painting. She said, "God told me that you were meant to be a painter. You should paint." Which is very interesting. I mean, though they were peasants, but they were peasants obviously with some degree of appreciation for learning. But he gets a portrait accepted in 1840. So now he can set up as a portraitist because he has the, kind of the stamp of the Salon. He's important enough that he can get into the Salon. So people will pay a good price for his portraits. And the same year, he marries a woman, Pauline Virginie Arnaud, who 4 years later dies of consumption, which is a theme that keeps coming up in this period. 1845, he has a civil marriage to a woman, Catherine Lemaire, and with whom he will stay for the rest of his life and have 9 kids. But in 1840, at the time that his portrait was accepted, he met Theodore Rousseau and he met Daumier, 2 of the members of the Barbizon school. And though he continues for a while to do classically inspired paintings, which you can see, this is the Rape of the Sabines. It's a very competent and quite effective piece of painting, but very conventional. Finally, in 1849, he settles in Barbizon with artists who he feels comfortable with, in a place that he feels comfortable, out in the countryside, away from the city. And he takes on the kind of subject matter that he knows, the life of the peasants. And this is actually the most ambitious painting he painted. It's quite large, and it received a gold medal at the Salon, the only time he received any honors at the Salon. But it catches the peasants as they are resting from hard work. And it's interesting to me because he's taken on a role a little like Bruegel the Elder. He's memorializing and capturing a world that is already vanishing, the peasant society. At a later stage than Bruegel dealt with it. It was still in a very high level of development when Bruegel did his work. And Bruegel took a more distant and actually humorous approach. But Millet takes it on almost as a crusade. He feels that the people of the earth, the peasants, are more honest and their life more sincere than the life of the city. And he wants to make this obvious to everyone in his work. So even though he always claims not to be political, he is being political, because to take the part of the working class at that point in time in France was to be political, whether you said you were or not. And the Salon looked at him askance because of his willingness to celebrate that world. A very famous image of his, the sower, which of course also has biblical implications. But you know, he's painting stuff, he's painting all the stuff he's painting, he lived. And in fact, even in Barbizon, he's very poor for a long time. He farms half the day, he works for other farmers, and the other half the day he paints, making just scratching out a living. But this is a painting that had a huge impact on Van Gogh. Van Gogh does several versions with the sower in his paintings. This shows what a highly competent painter of genre paintings this man was. You know, this is really a woman baking something in an oven. And like Daumier, washerwomen, but also look at the treatment of the figures. There's a certain simplicity, there's a looseness of line, very strong dark and light contrast. There's a very clear relation to the work of Daumier. He tends to carry detail further than Daumier did, but you can see a clear relation between their work. Harvesting potatoes. This is people who lived on potatoes were the most marginalized people in Europe. The introduction of the potato meant that people could live on land that you couldn't grow anything else. And it led to a population explosion of impoverished people who lived just on potatoes, mostly. And they were the people who were used as cannon fodder by the various countries in Europe. They were the people who ended up manning the ships, being sent overseas to fight, being drafted for the various military conflicts. And Van Gogh, who worshipped Millet, did a whole series of people harvesting, growing potatoes, and also that very famous painting of his, the Potato Eaters. Millet did print reproductions of almost everything he painted, and this is how people knew his work. Van Gogh had a collection of prints of Daumier's paintings, which he would draw on for painting material. Perhaps Millet's one of his most famous paintings, the Gleaners. And the Gleaners, goes all the way back to the Bible, the concept. People, impoverished women and children, were allowed to enter fields after the harvest and glean whatever they could, which meant actually picking up single grains in some cases. You see, and they're just gradually collecting enough food to live for another day. In the distance is the overseer on his horse, and the workmen who are busy building the haystacks. And this is actually Barbizon, where the painters lived and worked, in the distance, with the forest of Fontainebleau behind. This work impressed the Americans to no end, and actually, Walt Whitman at one point, let's see if I can find the quote, because it's kind of an amazing quote. Walt Whitman essentially said, "The Leaves of Grass," his most famous work, you're probably all familiar with it. The leaves of grass are really only Millet in another form. They are the Millet that Walt Whitman has succeeded in putting into words. I mean, you couldn't give a higher tribute to Millet. And it was the Americans who ended up Americans ended up acquiring a lot of his work, actually, because it wasn't acquired originally by the French. Boston has several of his paintings. After his death, there was a bidding war over one of his paintings, and it ended up selling for 800,000 gold francs. And the Parisians were so amazed and also appalled because after his death, his wife was living in poverty in Barbizon, that the French passed a law giving a portion of profits from paintings to the the families of artists. The Angelus. For some reason, this painting, well, let's first let me tell you what's going on here. The Angelus is the time, it's one of the 3 times during the day when they toll the bells of the church, and you see the little church in the distance, and the devout do a short prayer, which these potato harvesters are doing here, this moment. But for some reason, Salvador Dali was completely obsessed with this painting and did a number of variations of it himself. This one caused a stir at the salon. People were outraged that an exhausted laborer leaning on a hoe would be the subject of a painting. And foregrounded like this, so solidly, right in the center of the painting in a kind of a pyramidal, very stable pyramidal structure. But it's Millet, in a way, rubbing the face of the bourgeoisie in the hard work and toil of the rural class, you know. So he's not that different in certain ways from Daumier. Not much of a sense of humor, though. A shepherd tending his flock, again, a pyramidal form of a figure in almost the center of the painting. People planting potatoes. I think the interaction that's suggested by the connection of this couple here is very nicely understated in this. I think it's a very moving painting. Now, this is interesting because it's a nude that is so distant in my mind from the Renaissance nudes, which were all women as objects of desire. You know, you've got a woman in the woods who's naked. In the Renaissance, you would have had the elders, you know, Susanna and the elders looking over a hedge. But what's looking over the hedge here? Cows. And she's treated in a very unprovocative way, and beautifully painted. She's a goose girl. Young girls were given the job of herding the geese, which were an essential part of you know, the peasant culture because of the meat, the feathers, and the eggs.
It's interesting how he does her face and her hands and the back of her neck. I mean, you can tell she's working.
Yes.
side. Like I find that even that level of detail is really
Yeah.
in this, you know.
Yeah, well, he's really, I mean, he's really telling us what he knows, you know, in all his paintings. There's they're very thorough. This is later on an American commissioned him to do a whole series of pastels, and this is one of them. It's the calling in the cows at the end of the day. He's got some kind of well, it's probably a horn that he's blowing here. I think this is a stunning painting, and it's just slightly reminiscent of Vermeer and other Renaissance figure studies in this kind of lighting. But it's timeless, you know. I mean, this woman, I mean, maybe that hat sets her off as a particular period, but the whole scene could have happened over a couple of thousand years. This kind of lamp, this oil lamp is ancient. You know, you find them in Greece and ancient Rome. So there's a certain, you know, a sense of something that has gone on for a long time and is still going on. And during the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, a lot of, well, some of the French, Monet, Renoir, and a few other painters went to England. Millet chose to go back to the farm in Normandy, and he painted a number of coastal scenes, which shows that what a good landscapist he could be if he chose to be one. And it also, you know, Monet is also from Normandy, and we'll be looking at Monet's coastal scenes, and you can see that the handling of the paint in this and the treatment of the color, it's a low-keyed Monet, and it clearly had an influence on Monet, because at this point, 1870, the Impressionists are still beginning to find their way in their style, but they're very aware of these artists. They know these artists. They've had, you know, they've spent time with them. So this probably clearly had an influence on Monet. One of getting near the end of his life, in one of his later paintings, he was commissioned to do a series of seasons, and this is autumn. And again, here's Barbizon, the town of Barbizon. And there's a hint of Van Gogh in this painting, I think, which is not surprising if you know Van Gogh's work.
Yeah, I think the shadows make the painting.
Yes.
Like they're really black. They really set it off.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And this blue violet, which is a complement of the yellow ochre here, is very effective at creating this sense of a looming sky, but also the late light. This is a Normandy milkmaid. She's milked her cattle, and she's bringing the milk to market. And for some reason, they would stuff the top of the container with grass. I don't know why. But again, it looks like a lot of work carrying that huge thing full of milk all the way from the cattle back to the market or back home. This is his last painting, believe it or not. What in the world is going on?
Wow.
I mean, this is what's happening here, and it's a very disturbing painting, actually, especially when you know what's happening. This is something peasants would do in their search for protein. The boys would go out at night with hay, and they'd make these burning wands of hay, and they would surprise the pigeons where they were resting on the ground. And then as the pigeons flew up in the air, confused by the light, they would hit them with cudgels. And these other kids down here are gathering the birds. So it's kind of it's a very disturbing painting, I think. It's almost expressionist too.
Initially, I thought they were underwater.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah, it's but look at his mastery of light and of movement in this. The man is quite an incredible painter. So he gets quite ill towards the end of his life, and I'm trying to remember. I think he died at 61, leaving his family in Barbizon with almost no money. But Corot comes to the rescue of Millet's wife and gives her a huge amount of money. And also the Americans start to descend and purchase art. So he has a large posthumous recognition. But he was a man who said there was not a day in his life where he didn't work himself to the bone. A very hard life. So that's it for these two artists. Any feedback? And